At 2:14 p.m. on September 15, 1940, over the sprawling green of the Kentish countryside, Flight Lieutenant Dusty Miller, age 22, was about to die. He was flying a Supermarine Spitfire, the most beautiful killing machine ever forged by man, and he was locked in a dance of death with a Messerschmitt Bf-109. For 10 agonizing minutes, the two pilots have been locked in a ballet of climbing, turning, and firing, each seeking that fleeting moment of advantage that meant the difference between a celebratory drink in the mess hall and a fiery grave. The German pilot was good, arrogant, and he knew a secret. He knew the Spitfire's fatal flaw. As Dusty lined up for what he thought was the perfect shot, the Bf-109 did something that should have been suicidal. He pushed his control stick forward, plunging his aircraft into a steep, brutal dive. It was a move designed to escape, a maneuver that Spitfire pilots had learned to dread. Dusty, his blood up, did the only thing a hunter could do. He followed. He pushed the stick forward, and the magnificent Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the heart of his angel, betrayed him. The engine didn't explode. It didn't scream or shudder. It simply choked. A sudden, terrifying silence replaced the Merlin's reassuring roar, a silence broken only by the whistle of the wind over his canopy. The propeller windmilled uselessly. For a critical 3 seconds, Dusty was no longer a pilot. He was a passenger in a 6,000-pound metal glider. The phenomenon was known as negative G, a state where the upward push on the plane was less than the downward pull of gravity. To the engine, it was poison. The fuel, instead of being fed into the carburetor, was thrown up to the top of its chamber, away from the intake. The engine was starved. The German pilot, his own fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine performing flawlessly, knew this would happen. He leveled out at the bottom of his dive and looped back around, his cannons now aimed at the helpless, coasting Spitfire. Dusty wrestled with his controls, his stomach lurching, desperately trying to get the nose up to restore the flow of fuel. The Merlin coughed, sputtered, and finally roared back to life. But it was too late. The 109 was on him. Cannon shells ripped through his port wing, shattering the metal and crippling his aircraft. Only a desperate roll and the timely arrival of his wingman saved him from becoming another statistic of the Battle of Britain.
Back on the ground at RAF Hornchurch, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of fury and despair. Dusty's experience wasn't unique. It was a soul-crushing routine. The mechanics felt helpless, endlessly tuning engines that were mechanically perfect, yet possessed a flaw that was killing the men who flew them. The pilots, young men who lived on a diet of courage and black humor, were growing bitter. "It's a suicidal tactic," one would say, slamming his mug on the table. "They know we can't follow. They dive, we cuff, they turn, and we die." The official doctrine from Fort Knox, or in this case, the Air Ministry, was a joke. Pilots were instructed to perform a slow, gentle half-roll before entering a dive. This maneuver would maintain positive G, keeping the fuel where it needed to be. But in the heart of a swirling dogfight, taking 3 seconds to perform a graceful aerobatic maneuver was like sending the enemy a written invitation to shoot you down. It was a solution devised by engineers in a lab, men who had never seen a 109 fill their rearview mirror. The price of their theoretical solution was paid in the blood of men like Dusty Miller. The report on his incident, like dozens before it, would sit on a desk for 3 weeks before being filed away. The system was failing its heroes. The solution to this fatal flaw was not born in a high-tech laboratory or a general's briefing room. It was discovered in a noisy, grease-stained workshop at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough by a woman who understood machines better than most men understood themselves. Her name was Beatrice Shilling, though everyone called her Tilly. She was an engineer, a motorcycle racer, and a woman who possessed a mind as sharp and uncompromising as a blade. In the male-dominated world of military engineering, she was an outsider. She wasn't a pilot, and she didn't care for military protocol, but she had a unique gift. She listened. She didn't just read the dry technical reports about engine failure. She went to the airfields. She stood on the cold, damp grass and talked to the grease-stained mechanics and the haunted-eyed pilots. She heard the frustration in their voices, the raw terror of an engine going silent at 10,000 feet. She understood that this wasn't an acceptable performance limitation. It was a death sentence. While others saw a complex fluid dynamics problem requiring a total redesign of the carburetor, Tilly saw something simpler. She saw a plumbing problem.
The eureka moment did not come from a complex calculation on a slide rule. It came, as all brilliant ideas do, from a moment of profound, simple clarity. One evening, working late in the RAE workshop, surrounded by the guts of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, Tilly was contemplating the carburetor's float chamber. The problem was painfully obvious. Under -G, the fuel sloshed upwards, away from the needle jet that fed the engine. But in that same moment, the excess fuel would also flood the engine's supercharger, causing the violent choking and sputtering. The engine was simultaneously starving and flooding. It's like trying to drink from a glass of water while someone is shaking you violently. You get nothing in your mouth and spill the rest all over your shirt. The official solution being worked on by Rolls-Royce was a complex pressurized carburetor, a project that was months, maybe years away from deployment. The pilots didn't have years. They barely had hours. Tilly picked up a small metal washer from a workbench. What if, she thought, you didn't stop the fuel from sloshing? What if you just controlled how much could get out? The idea was incredibly, beautifully stupid. She envisioned a small metal restrictor, a simple disc with a precisely drilled hole in the center, fitted into the fuel line. The hole would be just large enough to allow the maximum amount of fuel the engine could possibly need under full power, but no more. When the -G force hit and the fuel sloshed, the restrictor would prevent the massive surge that caused the flooding. The engine might still be momentarily starved, but it wouldn't be drowned in its own fuel. It wouldn't choke and die. It would cough, perhaps, but it would keep running. It was a 50-cent solution to a multi-million-pound problem. It was not elegant. It did not follow the pristine theories of advanced carbureting. It was a patch, a workaround, a piece of metal that violated a dozen engineering regulations. It was, in short, perfect. She sketched it on a piece of scrap paper, a small, thimble-shaped brass fitting with a hole in the middle. It would later be officially designated the RAE restrictor, but to the pilots whose lives it would save, it would forever be known by a more intimate name, Miss Shilling's orifice. The secret had been discovered. Now it had to be proven.
Getting the device tested through official channels would have taken months. Reports would need to be filed, committees formed, and endless tests run in controlled, non-combat environments. Tilly and the pilots didn't have months, so they broke the rules. A young, daring squadron leader at RAF Tangmere, a man who had already lost 3 pilots to the engine flaw, listened to Tilly's impassioned technical explanation. He looked at the simple metal thimble in her hand, then at the faces of his remaining pilots. "To hell with the regulations," he said. "Put it in my plane." The first battle test of Miss Shilling's orifice was not a sanctioned military trial, it was a conspiracy. On a cold October morning, the squadron leader took off on a routine patrol, his Spitfire's Merlin engine fitted with the small, unauthorized piece of brass. For an hour, the flight was uneventful. Then, the call came. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. A squadron of Bf-109s was diving on them out of the sun. The moment of truth had arrived. The lead German pilot, spotting the Spitfire, did exactly what they always did. He pushed his stick forward, initiating a dive he knew the British plane couldn't follow. The squadron leader took a deep breath and did the unthinkable. He followed. He shoved his control column forward, forcing the Spitfire into a stomach-churning dive. His body strained against the harness, the negative G trying to lift him from his seat. He braced for the silence, the horrifying cough from his Merlin engine that had spelled doom for so many of his friends. But the silence never came. The engine sputtered for a fraction of a second, a single brief hesitation that was almost imperceptible, and then it continued to roar. The small brass restrictor was doing its job, metering the fuel, preventing the flood. Below him, the German pilot, expecting to be alone, glanced back. The look of sheer, abject shock on his face must have been extraordinary. The Spitfire was still there, glued to his tail, its 8 Browning machine guns glinting in the sun. For the German, it was like watching a ghost. For the squadron leader, it was a revelation. He pulled the trigger, the bullets hit home, the engine exploded, the Bf-109 fell from the sky, a plume of black smoke marking the grave of a flawed assumption. Incredibly, it worked.
When the squadron leader landed, he was mobbed by his pilots and mechanics. He was ecstatic, almost delirious with the new power he had felt. "It works!" he yelled over the sound of the idling engine. "By God, it works!" He turned to Tilly, who was waiting anxiously by the runway, her face smudged with grease. "Miss Shilling," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I don't care what the Air Ministry says, I want that little device in every plane in this squadron by tomorrow morning." He had just committed a serious breach of military protocol, authorizing a non-standard modification to his aircraft. He had risked his career, but he had also found the key to survival. He became the innovation's first patron, its protector. And so began the underground spread. The news traveled not through official memos, but in hushed conversations in mess halls and whispered tips in hangars. A pilot from Tangmere would tell his wingman from Biggin Hill. That wingman would beg his mechanic to get him one of Tilly's washers. The legend had begun. Beatrice Shilling and a small, trusted team of RAE mechanics became a clandestine traveling road show. They moved from airfield to airfield across southern England, working outside the official supply chain. They arrived in unmarked vans, carrying toolboxes filled with the small, precious brass restrictors. They were a conspiracy of frontline soldiers, mechanics, and one brilliant female engineer against the slow, grinding bureaucracy of the system. The work was often done at night, in dimly lit hangars, away from the prying eyes of by-the-book staff officers. A squadron's entire fleet of Spitfires and Hurricanes would be secretly modified between dusk and dawn. The mechanics shared the simple drawings amongst themselves, sometimes crudely scratching the dimensions onto a cigarette packet. It was a grassroots rebellion fueled by desperation and a shared secret. The pilots who had the device felt like they belonged to a secret brotherhood, possessing a weapon the enemy couldn't comprehend and their own high command hadn't yet sanctioned. The change was immediate and dramatic. Squadrons equipped with Miss Shilling's orifice saw their kill rates climb and, more importantly, their casualty rates plummet. The unofficial modifications could not stay secret for long.
The numbers were too compelling. A pragmatic air vice marshal, a man who cared more about dead Germans than pristine engine regulations, noticed the anomaly. Certain squadrons were suddenly performing miracles. Their combat reports spoke of dogfights that defied the known limitations of the Spitfire. He saw the statistics, a survival rate in diving engagements that had increased by a staggering amount. He summoned the squadron leader from Tangmere, the patron, for a meeting. There was no shouting, no threats of a court-martial. The air marshal, a shrewd leader named Hugh Dowding, simply laid a stack of reports on his desk. "Tell me what's going on," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The squadron leader, knowing he was risking everything, told him the truth. He spoke of a fatal flaw, of the pilots they had lost, and of a civilian engineer named Beatrice Shilling and her ridiculously simple, unauthorized fix. He explained how a 50-cent piece of metal was changing the course of the air war. The air marshal listened patiently, his face unreadable. When the squadron leader had finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Bureaucracy demanded a full investigation, a grounding of the modified planes, and a severe reprimand for all involved. The war demanded results. Dowding stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sky that his young pilots were fighting and dying in every day. The system was slow, cautious, and disconnected from the bloody reality of combat. The men on the front lines had created their own system, one that worked. This was the moment of decision, the dramatic climax of the man versus system conflict. He turned back from the window. "I want to see it," he said. "Arrange a demonstration. Tomorrow." He wanted personal verification. The confrontation was set. The fate of the small invention and the pilots who depended on it rested on a single flight.
The next day, on a wind-swept airfield, the demonstration took place. 2 Spitfires stood ready. One, a standard model, straight from the factory. The other, fitted with Tilley's small brass restrictor. The air marshal stood on the brass, arms crossed, his face grim. 2 experienced pilots took off and climbed to 10,000 feet. On the radio, the command was given, "Commence diving maneuver." Both planes nosed over into a steep dive. For the first 2 seconds, they were perfectly matched. Then, the inevitable happened. The engine of the standard Spitfire, its carburetor starved and flooded, let out the familiar, sickening cough. It sputtered violently, losing power and speed, its propeller windmilling as it fell out of formation. The other Spitfire, however, continued its dive as if tethered to an invisible wire. Its Merlin engine roared with uninterrupted power. It was a stark, irrefutable, and deeply shocking demonstration. The fatal flaw and its brilliant, simple solution laid bare in the sky for High Command to see.
The numbers that followed were the final, irrefutable proof of the unsung genius's contribution. The tactical advantage held by the Bf-109 and its fuel-injected engine was neutralized overnight. Spitfire pilots could now dictate the terms of an engagement, following the enemy into any maneuver without fear. The kill ratio, which had been dangerously close to parity, shifted decisively in favor of the RAF. It is estimated that Beatrice Shilling's simple 50-cent piece of metal saved the lives of over 2,100 pilots, men who would go on to have families, to build the post-war world, owed their existence to a small brass thimble and the woman who dared to invent it. She had given the angel of the skies back its heart. The fatal flaw was dead. And what of the hero of our story? What became of Beatrice Tilly Shilling after the war? She did not receive the highest honors of the state. There were no grand parades in her name, no statues erected in public squares. She was awarded the Order of the British Empire, OBE, a respectable honor, but one that hardly reflected the magnitude of her contribution. Officially, the final solution to the carburetor problem was the Advanced Pressurized Unit developed by Rolls-Royce, a project that her invention had given them the time to complete. Her orifice was seen as a brilliant but temporary field modification. After the war, she simply returned to her life. She continued her career as a respected engineer and spent her weekends doing what she loved, racing her powerful Norton motorcycle, often winning against the men who dared to challenge her. She remained, to the public, an unknown. Her name was never taught in schools. She was the quintessential unsung hero, a woman who saved thousands and asked for nothing in return.
But her invention had an eternal life. The RAE restrictor, or copies of it, continued to be used in various aircraft for years. The principle behind it, that a simple, robust fix on the front line is better than a perfect, theoretical solution in a laboratory, became an unwritten standard in military engineering. Her legacy wasn't cast in bronze or carved in stone. It lived in the quiet confidence of pilots in future conflicts, in planes that performed as they were supposed to, thanks to the lessons learned from her defiant act of practical genius. The legend of Ms. Shilling's orifice was passed down not in history books, but from one generation of pilots and mechanics to the next, a piece of folklore, a secret whispered with a knowing smile. Officially, it was just a footnote in the history of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Unofficially, it was the thing that had saved them all. The moral of this story is as simple and powerful as the invention at its heart. History is not a grand automated machine, driven by the plans of generals and the designs of distant engineers. It is a messy, human affair, shaped in moments of crisis by ordinary people who see a real problem and dare to break the rules to solve it. Wars are won by the unsung geniuses, the mechanics, the nurses, the sergeants, and the quiet engineers like Beatrice Shilling, who fight on two fronts, against the enemy and against the foolishness of their own systems. Her story is a testament to the individual who, armed with nothing but insight and courage, can change the world. She remains a ghost in the machine of history, a secret whispered on the wind over the fields of Kent, the woman whose 50-cent washer saved a nation.